All right, welcome to our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, June 1st, 2023, with Dennis Christianson. Dennis, I will be talking about him in a minute. Just first of all, I want to thank him for coming all the way from Hawaii, which is 6 hours behind the New York people here. So, Dennis, thank you.
You bet.
Just for some other news, next week we have David Krell. David has spoken to us in the past. Going to be talking about the 1966 baseball season and basically the Giants' propensity to finish in second place in the 60s. After that, we have Storm and Norm Coleman, who will be talking about the different ballparks and the significance of the Giants in many of those ballparks. And then we have John Leonudakis, who's going to be talking about Lefty O'Doul and some other Monty Irvin. He'll have some quick couple of movie vignettes that'll be real interesting.
Norm is on a Wednesday, right?
Norm is on a Wednesday. And then we will, so we'll have three meetings in a row after this. And then we'll break for the 4th of July. The week before that, people go away and stuff. Without further ado, I want to introduce Dennis Christianson. Dennis co-wrote a book with Les Keiter in 1991, a long time ago, called 50 Years Behind the Microphone, the Les Keiter story. Many of you guys have spoken incessantly of Les Keiter. We had the great Kurt Smith talking about broadcasters, but Les Keiter did recreations. He did more than Giant stuff, and Dennis Christianson is kind enough to join us tonight to tell us all about some of the work of one of your favorite announcers. So without any further ado, Dennis Christianson. Dennis, welcome to the society tonight.
Well, thanks so much. And Gary, you said it was like mostly a bunch of old guys, and you guys all look the same age as me, so I'm much younger than I expected. So we're in good shape. But thanks so much. It's funny because I in some ways I feel like I am doing a bit of a recreation here. This book, and I can just dive in and talk a little bit about how the book came to be. Yeah, as I started to say a little bit earlier, Les finished his career in Honolulu. He actually was in Honolulu 3 times. He came out right after December 7th. He joined the Navy and was shipped out here and wound up going and serving in the Pacific, building air bases out in the South Pacific Islands, and that was his first time through here. He didn't remember it terribly fondly. There was a war on, and then came back in the 60s for a period, and then came back to stay in the 70s. And so he ended his career here working for the NBC affiliate, and I worked I was directing the newscast at the time in the booth, and that's how we met. And he was, by the time we got around to doing the book some years later, he was about 70 years old, and I was 30 something, and he seemed impossibly, a veteran and old to me. And I've realized with some chagrin that I'm his age now. But he was just a great guy. Did the newscast at Sportscast 6 and 10 for years and years and years, up to the point where we'd have to bring in the camera about 3 feet from his face so he could read the teleprompter. But he, never lost a bit up here. And we got talking between newscasts and so on. And I said something effective, you should write a book. And he said, well, how would I do that? And it turned into me going over to his house, or sometimes at the golf course he would play around the corner from where he lived. And we'd sit for an hour, 2 hours with a tape recorder And this is back in the 80s. So it was like a Sony tape recorder, and there's nothing you could do on a computer. There's nothing to look up. There was no internet. And we would just, there's a term in Hawaii called that we would just talk story, or he would just talk story to me. And that's how we did it. It started off very free form, and I'd find someone to transcribe the tapes, and eventually wound up with just hundreds of pages of transcripts, which at one point I terrifyingly realized I was expected to turn into a book. And that's how we put it together. It was mainly him telling stories in no particular order. We'd sit down and what do you want to talk about today? So, well, I've been thinking, kid. I've been thinking, maybe we should let's talk about some boxing tonight. And it'd be like hitting a button, the go button, and he would just start recounting his career. And all of us in Hawaii, not all of us, but all of us, a lot of us younger folks in Hawaii, we had no idea. We had no idea of his years in New York, of his years in Philadelphia, of his doing, the Clay Liston fight, which was ironic because I remember hearing that fight when I was about 10 years old over at my uncle's house on the radio. Had no idea, but he was just our old sports guy, and then these stories start coming out, so it was that was how we wrote the book. And so I was just tried to be a faithful listener to it. That's how it all began. I'll actually pause so you can ask questions in between, because like Les, I can just talk and talk and talk. Ask any of my employees.
Dennis, why don't you tell us about his time recreating the Giant games? That's what most of the guys in here remember fondly. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I'll just I'll talk a little bit, just set it up about his New York years. He at that point was in his career. Was actually working in that first it was the early stint in San Francisco, and there was a guy who figured very large in his life, and it figures into the recreation story too. Guy named Jay. I want to make sure I say it right. I've seen it recently. J. Elroy McCaw, and J. Elroy McCaw, over the course of his career, had built a bunch of radio stations. That's how Les got his first job at his first full job as a sportscaster in Centralia Jails in Eastern Washington. That's how he wound up in San Francisco. It's how he wound up in Honolulu, and eventually J. Elroy came to own WINS in New York, and he invited Les to come out in 1952 to be his news director, and that was how he got started in New York. And as we were talking a little bit at the beginning there, he did Knicks games. He came to do the New York Giants. He did the Yankees pre-show, and he would then hand it off to first Mel Allen, later Red Barber, for the actual games. And that was kind of what made a lot of his career there. And it was in 58 or the fall of 57, after the Dodgers and the Giants had announced their moves to move to the West Coast, that the same J. Elroy McCaw came and said, "I've got the best idea in the world. I've got the greatest idea in the world. It's going to make you famous." And he said, "I want you to do the Dodgers or the Giants." And like, "Have you been following the news?" And he said, "No, I know. I want you to do it. I want you to do their games from the West Coast." and Les realized he was asking him to do recreates, which is something he had done throughout his career. All the old guard radio guys did back then, and he was totally against it. He told his boss, the owner of the station, that he was crazy, that he'd be a laughing stock. It would ruin his career, and it took some weeks for him to, or months actually, to talk and cajole and twist arms to talk Les into doing it. And then he said, "So what's it going to be, the Dodgers or the Giants?" And Les had said, even though the Dodgers were the more winning team at that time, said, well, they're aging, they're getting out, and the Giants look a lot more interesting. They've got all these young players coming up. They got Willie Mays, who's maybe the most popular sports figure in New York at that time. Let's do the Giants. And that's how he began doing the recreates, which I can talk about in a bit too. There is, by the way, a chapter in the book that wound up being just about recreates and just about this Giant story. And I'll put it in the chat later on. I copied it out of the book. Don't tell the publisher. I'm breaking federal copyright law for you guys. Because it's only a dozen pages, but it's fascinating. So I'll pause for a second because I see a couple of questions there, and I'll let you guys moderate. I think Dan, I saw your hand go up pretty early. Dan Taylor.
Why don't we start with, we'll go with Mars, then Dan, then Steve, and then we'll continue. So Mars, go ahead.
Thank you, Dennis, for joining us. Les Keiter was actually my favorite announcer. So the first question I have, was it 58, 59, 60, and 61, or was it only 2 years that he recreated the games?
No, he did it. I'd have to double check. He did it for a number of years.
Just the Giants, I mean.
Yeah, just the Giants. I'll check right now. That's the interesting thing. When Gary called me up, it's like, it's been 30-something years since I wrote this with Les. And it's like, well, I better go do some freaking homework. And found the thing and started going.
He has such a great fan base here.
It was great. It was great reading it again. It was kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. That's right. I remember that story now. So I'll fact check that in a second. And I'll have to confirm. I think he did it for 3 years. And of course, a lot of this was the technology eventually catching up, because at that time, it was still really the only way to do it, with him reading the plays off of a telex machine, coming in chunk-a-da, and him, an assistant, because he wanted to do them live. A lot of the recreates that Les did over the years, and that all the guys at that era did, it would be some hours after the game. They'd have it all in front of them, usually pretty short, very short notes. I mean, it would be like, so and so comes to bat.
15 minutes tape delayed. The
There,
reason being is, when I listened, it was 11:15 at night, to my recollection, for a night game, 11:15 New York time, and 4:15 for a day game. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think it was too delayed. He got it all off of the Western Union ticker tape. And yeah. I wanted to make a comment on my favorite game he broadcasted. At first, I thought it was a inside the park grand slammer hit by Ed Bersude. But a friend of mine that went to Cupertino High School in San Bruno Danny Murtaugh's sister was his teacher in high school. They took him to the game, and of course, Danny Murtaugh was the Pittsburgh manager, so he was at Candlestick, and it was an inside the park 3-run homer. Les Keiter was announcing it. If you've ever seen that Bugs Bunny cartoon, Bugs Bunny on first, Bugs Bunny on second,
Yeah.
and then they keep on a continuous mambo around the bases. It seemed like that home run and the base runners took forever, the way Keiter described it so beautifully. So are there any saved recreated tapes?
I've never heard of any from that era. I never heard them, and he never mentioned them. I know he mentioned a couple of times that he wished he had that the technology was around then. There was, of course, no videotape back then. There were kinescopes of some of the big live events, which were, later transferred and secured, like the boxing matches. But most of the games and all that stuff is pretty much lost to history. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dennis.
You bet. It's great fun.
Were the Giants in San Francisco behind this, like in favor of it, besides the manager of WINS?
I'm sorry, Gary, can you say again?
Were the San Francisco Giants, in favor of this, as well as the general manager of WINS in New York?
They were, because it was the only, there are a lot of those folks who they knew that, especially the players, they knew they had a big fan base in New York. They built it up for generations, and so a lot of them felt very cut off. It was the only way. It was the only way to do it at that time, and so he had. Les had said it's not in the book, but he had said a couple times that when he was talking about the aftermath of it and people coming up afterward and thanking him, people who many people, and I'll tell you a story about this in a second too, didn't know they were recreations. Thought he was somehow broadcasting live, and then they'd see him at a restaurant in Manhattan and say, "How did you get here? How did you get back here so fast?" Because he had just left the studio and walked uptown, and that people who didn't know it, but the other part, he said he would also hear from some of his friends and stuff on the team who and I don't remember who the player was, but telling him, "I heard you made me sound better than I was," because again, what would come through, and there's some examples in what I'll throw in the chat, what some of these printouts looked like, but it would literally just say so and so bats left, pops out center field. That would be, and this way, the San Francisco games were a little more detailed than that, but in some of the games he did over the years, that's all he would have. He'd have to imagine the whole rest of the game. And if there were delays, like the ticker tape stopped or something, there would often be, catcher pitcher conferences, or three foul tips in a row, and so on, until things could catch up again. But
I know you had an illustrious career. Is this what he's most, in your mind and in his talking to you, is this what he's most known for, do you feel? Or?
No, I think it all depends. It depends on the time of his career and where the fans were. He was the voice of the New York Giants football team for 7 years, 7 seasons. He was the voice of the Knicks. The Yankees fans knew him from the pregame show. So it all had to do with kind of what sport you followed, what team you followed. And of course, a lot of boxing fans knew him. He probably had the longest career in boxing. I mean, you go all the way from, well, there were earlier fights, but if you take all the way just to hit the big parts of the spectrum, all the way from Clay Liston in 64 to the Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, no mas fight. I mean, that spans the better part of 35 years. And that last one was after he was in Honolulu, and Don King just showed up with an entourage at a dinner, heard Les Keiter lived here, invited him to dinner. That's how he wound up flying off to do the Duran Leonard fight. So a lot of people know him from that. So he was, you know, he was, and Philadelphia fans, you know, knew him for, well, he did a season of the 76ers and the first season of the 76ers when they had just moved up from Buffalo, or moved down from Buffalo, I suppose. You know, and other sports he called over time. So I think you could ask 100 people and get 100 answers on that one. I know from this crowd it would be.
Thanks so much. The dulcet tones of Mr. Dan Taylor. Dan, all yours.
Well, Dennis, mahalo. This is terrific. And I hope when I get to my question, I'm not jumping too far ahead, but I wanted to start with a story and then kind of a two-pronged question. My story, in 93, I was over covering the Aloha Bowl when Fresno State was in it, and I was doing local TV here. And we would come to the station to edit and to feed our stuff back to the mainland. And first day, we pulled into that employees lot, and the first stall, or one of the first stalls, was the sign reserved for Les Keiter. You know, and I just admired him so much. I was like, you know, it was a thrill just to see this parking space. And I'd hoped to be able to meet him, you know, a few times we did come in the building, but he was never there at that time. But it was a kind of a neat experience for me anyway.
Oh, he would love that.
My question, kind of two-pronged. The Islanders had some tremendous broadcasters over the years. Al Michaels, of course. Mel Proctor went on and called Orioles and Rangers games. Was Les ever kind of a mentor to these guys? And the second part of that question, I seem to recall he did recreates of Islander games when they were on the mainland. I could be wrong. And if he did, would that make him the last guy ever to do recreates?
Probably on a regular basis. And I'll tell you, I'll answer that with a couple of stories. First is I used to park in Les's space during the day because I would have for a period of time I was working on a morning shift, which was god awful, and he wouldn't come until the afternoons and yeah, you can use my space, and I'd forget sometimes, and to see him in his office, Les, oh, it's okay, Keith. Yeah, you know, he was. It's funny. So I first heard Les Keiter. Well, besides when I was a kid, and I happened to hear him do that. Do the Clay List thing. I didn't know what a sports announcer was probably at that time. Just remember listening to the fight with my uncle and my dad. But we would. I when I first moved to Honolulu, I was, you know, whatever, 20 stupid years old, and I was working out at that end of the island, Pearl Ridge, not far from there, and I'd be driving home at 7 o'clock at night, and I'd see all these lights up in Aloha Stadium. Wouldn't see very many people in the top deck because they didn't have any people come to the stadium. And so I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Oh, that's the Islanders game." Somebody told me you can listen to it on I think it was KORL, and so I saw it one day and up and down the AM dial and tuned it in and was listening to it, and that's when I first heard Les Keiter doing the games there. And so it became kind of a go-to thing. And so I would, I'd also listen to their away games. And I listened to their away games that whole season before I happened to mention to somebody. And the first time, I'd been listening for at least a year before I knew that he was doing recreates. I had no idea that I was listening to him do the away games that way and occasionally the ones at the field. So I think probably because that would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's hard to imagine. You know, I don't know. Maybe there were some other, you know, AA, AAA clubs that might have still been doing that, but they probably weren't the last. You know, Al Michaels came through the studio a couple of times. At that time, by then he was, you know, becoming very famous, and would drop by the studio and say hi. And he would always say really kind things like, "This guy taught me everything I know about this," and I don't know if it's true, but it was very, very gracious, and Les had to inspire a lot of guys over the years.
And some of us know of him through Hawaii 5-0.
That's where he got the name the General,
Ah,
because
that's right.
he played in a couple of episodes. He played a general, and Joe Moore, who was our former sports guy and had become our news anchor, is still anchoring the news. Still one of my good friends. We're on an episode, and he was a more junior officer, and he was and Les was playing a grizzled old general, and so he started calling him the General on air, and so for the better part of a decade and a half here, everybody here in Hawaii knew him as the General.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Dan. Steve, you're up.
There's, this is 65 years ago this took place. Mars was definitely correct. 11:15 was the night game, which, yeah, we had the transistor radios, but nobody was able to stay up all night long. My advantage was my father was a baker, worked at nights, and he had the radio blaring in the bakery. So the next morning, I got the update. The day game, and I'm almost 100% sure it started at 6:06. And Northwest Orient was the commercial for them. Now, let me ask you, this is a technical question, which, really has no bearing. The game started probably 4:00 New York time, live. Right. So why 6:06? Was there some kind of a thing with if you don't know, it's not a big deal. I just thought 11:15, I understand. But why 6:06? Yeah. Was there a news report before there for 5 minutes, maybe?
No, but I'll tell you what that might have well been was just to give enough time for the wire service in San Francisco to be putting things up on the teletype for it to get ripped off from the newsroom and run up to Les in the studio. As he told the story, and as I said, most of his a lot of recreates were done an hour later, half an hour later. In fact, he thought he would be doing it in the evening time slot. So that, okay, great, it'll be done. The night game will happen in San Francisco. I'll have time to do it, and I'll do it. And when he found out that no, we're going to do it quote unquote live, but I'm guessing it was there's no tape, so it wasn't necessarily tape delayed, but it was as live as it could be. And
he was so good. I mean, his sayings. Giants give the Dodgers the willies. Kirkland McCovey. But the game that I'm sure Harvey remembers this one too, and I'm Mars too, that 11-1 game with the Pirates, where the Giants score 9 runs in the 9th inning, leave the bases loaded, and Don Tarzik pops up. And as creative as Les Keiter was, it could be Kirkland hit a home run, and he's saying people are heading towards the exits. After the second home run, which ended up being now they're only, I guess, 6 behind, the people are coming back to their seats. stuff like that.
And that would absolutely not have been on that would absolutely not have been on the tape. That was entirely entirely like envisioned in his head. Time. Yeah.
Killing time. It was great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you bet. This is great fun. There's a story in the book about him. I think it was recreating a football game, and it was later commented on by a New York press columnist, saying that how Les Keiter controls time and space, because he was calling it. He's on the 5, he's on the 4, he's on the 3, he's on the 2. He said it was the slowest touchdown in NFL history.
By the way, for those who are interested, there's a Les Keiter live broadcast of New York Giants football, December 1959, and it's available free on YouTube, the entire game.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Steve. Mr. Klink, you're up.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you, Dennis, for, the recreation is something so little of us know a lot about. Now we know a whole lot more about. If I could move you about 6,000 miles east in a non-created, recreated sense, he did broadcast for the Phillies, which, if truth be known, are actually, don't slap me silly for this, my second favorite team for a lot of reasons. One of which I stole seats out of Connie Mack Stadium on July 4th, 1972. I think the statute of limitations has run on that one. Harvey,
We're both admitting to committing crimes today here.
yes, we're admitting to crimes, but he obviously he was with the Phillies, and I went through some Phillies material I have, and I couldn't figure out, didn't find his picture, so I wasn't sure. Did he ever talk about his time with Hall of Famer Byron Saum? Because By was very low key, and I would think he would be a real contrast. Did he talk about the live broadcast at all with the Phillies and how bad they were?
He didn't. I don't recall that, and it was so hard to get. Les was such a nice man. He's just got to be. He's just got to be one of the sweetest people people I've ever known. And he would, getting him to say something, even after getting, at one point, he tells a story about Marty Glickman in the book where he had gone out of his way at one point to maybe try and bring Marty in. Trying to remember, it must have been for one of the seasons of the Giants to do color with him, and he thought he'd always admired him and always had nice comments from him, and he called up Marty and said, "Hey, I've got an okay to do this," because he was the sports director of WINS. And Marty Glickman said, "What the hell are you talking about? I'm Marty Glickman. I don't do color for anybody. I'm nobody's second banana," and hung up the phone on him. And that was about the darkest story. Even the stories about Cosell, he ultimately would always smile at the end. But that was Howard. That's the way Howard was. But no, I didn't hear that story. I'm sorry.
Did he ever, give you a Hawaii instance? A famous or infamous pitcher lived there for many years, Frank Sullivan. I was going to ask you personally, did you ever know Frank or have any interaction with him, the old Philly? No?
I didn't. Apologies. I wish I had more that. I wish I was more. I wish I was more present at the time. I didn't realize the opportunities, the stories I could have asked, or even over the years, some of the people I could have met. When you're 30 and 20 and 30, you're mainly thinking about yourself. Yeah. But not now. Of course, we're all much wiser than that. We wouldn't behave that way today at all, any of us.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. This has been fun.
Harvey is a lovely name. Harvey, you're the man.
Les Keiter, can you hear me, Gary? Did I unmute?
Fine.
Okay. Les Keiter is a bridge in my childhood. I mean, I'm a New York Giants fan. Up until a few years ago, I used to not wear a San Francisco hat. And I would explain that I root for a team that plays their home games 3,000 miles from me. But Les Keiter, I learned a lot of things about the world from Les Keiter. I learned about time zones, which I didn't understand at the time. And I don't know when I first learned about recreations, but I used to listen to them. I can't remember the exact time they started in the day, but the day game was always, Les was still announcing the game or recreating the game, and it was over. And I remember one time my dad got home from work and I'm listening to the game and he tells me the score. That was not good. And to this day, if I can't watch the Giants or whatever I'm watching and I'm DVRing the game, I'll tell people, I told Gary when I was DVRing a hockey game, Gary, don't tell me the score. I'm going to watch it. Les Keiter taught me that. My favorite Les Keiter call was when, and I swear it was Willie Mays. And Willie was legging out a triple. And Les Keiter would tell you that Willie was rounding first and second. And then he would say, you should see him run. Recreating, and I am telling you, in my mind, I could see him run. I could see Willie run. Now, Les couldn't see him run. But that's how good I mean, he was good. So it brings back a lot of good memories. And I mean, you're saying that one of the reasons he chose the Giants as opposed to the detestable Dodgers to recreate was Willie Mays. And Willie is the connection for a lot of us. Thank you very much for joining us.
No, you bet. You know, there's two things to spin off that. One is, you talk about bridging eras, and I mean, Les really did, when you think about it. Les started his career prior to television. He was broadcasting when it was all radio. He came in and began with doing television, but still doing a lot of things exclusively on radio. He covered the 68 Olympics for Mutual Radio. His co-broadcaster for that was Jesse Owens. And he was doing that, and of course that was also the year of not just a lot of amazing things in the Olympics, Mark Spitz and so on, but the famous protest and the black-fisted salute, which then there's a story in the book specifically on that because of an incident between Jesse Owens and Carl Smith and sorry, going up on it, but I'm sorry, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, Carlos Smith, and between John Carlos and him, where John Carlos called Jesse Owens out for being an Uncle Tom. I mean, and just being there live. But anyway, he was doing radio back at that time, even as his coming. He was doing. He describes this for covering auto racing and doing the 12 hours of Sebring. He says, you can't imagine what it's like to do a radio broadcast for 12 hours. So things like that. But he bridged that era, and then to cable, and to live TV first, then cable TV, with things like tape delay and all that sort of stuff. He retired by the time he actually there was stuff coming over via internet in the very end of his career. He was retiring, but to go all the way from the folks that were his heroes, back when he was growing up, to the next generation, people like Al Michaels and all that, pretty amazing. The other thing you mentioned there that talking about how visual he was, when he would tell stories, when we were doing the book and he would doing our talk stories, and he would tell his he'd start describing a game or describing something or boxing. I remember boxing matches in particular, and as he was telling it, he would shift. He wouldn't be looking at me necessarily, sort of be looking off a little bit, and he'd shift from past tense to present tense while he was telling the stories. The bell rings for the third round, and listen walk walks out. He's saying, and everything was present tense. It wasn't like walked out anymore. It wasn't. He's circling. He's circling to the left. His left arm, you can see how heavy it's getting. and he's describing this all in first person, and it was something that took a while. I didn't even quite notice it until I was starting to go through the transcripts, and I had to start taking things and going, oh my gosh, I gotta switch everything to the same tense. But it was that visual sense. I mean, he had clearly packed away many visual cues of watching Willie Mays play in New York before he was describing him playing in San Francisco. And just so much stuff just tapped away in his head, and he would just access it in real time and play the movies back. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Thank you, Harvey. Mr. Manis, you're up.
How you doing, Dennis?
Good.
Can you just clarify something for me? A few minutes ago, you were talking about Marty Glickman, that it was suggested that he do color for the Giants. Were you talking about the baseball or the football Giants? Because I remember Glickman was the play-by-play on WNEW radio in New York of the New York Giants, football Giants. And he was the best. I used to love him, listening to him. And those were the days where the home games were blacked out. And WNEW AM was where I went to, follow the football Giants every other Sunday, at least when they were at home. So I got confused. Were you talking about him being suggested to be a color for the baseball or the football Giants? Because I know he did play-by-play for the football Giants for many years.
Yeah. Here we go. So Marty preceded him on the Giants, I think, as I'm reading right. I can read it straight from the book. It would be a personal thrill to work with some of his stature. And so it was the football Giants. And I guess I was a little naive when I called him up, relative rookie to established sportscaster, and offered a job to continue with Giants football. So that at that point,
he was play-by-play.
And he had been play-by-play, and Lesson wanted to bring him in to do color with him now that he was the play-by-play guy. And that was that.
And if you don't mind, I have one correction to make for you.
Oh, I'm probably, believe me, I hope nobody's fact-checking this whole thing.
No, it's really an insignificant correction, but you were talking about the Philadelphia 76ers, a while back. They didn't come from Buffalo. They came from Syracuse. They were the Syracuse Nats.
Yes,
Dolph
you're right.
Shays was their big player.
Yes,
and
you're right. My
Syracuse
apologies.
University graduate, I'm kind of, I was before my time, but I'm a little bit familiar with that. In fact, Marty Glickman is a Syracuse graduate, and he ran in the Olympics, the Berlin Olympics in '36, right in the face of Adolf Hitler. So Glickman had a checkered history.
Yeah, and let's describe that in the book. No, and of course you're right about Syracuse. And I don't know if it was an insult to Buffalo or to Syracuse, whoever it was. I apologize to them both.
A lot of snow in both places, so don't worry about it. And one more thing, I did meet Glickman. I was very friendly with Ernie Grunfeld. We went to summer camp together. And one time in Midtown Manhattan, when he was GM of the Knicks, he was walking on 7th Avenue in the city, and he said hello to me. And I saw him. I said, Ernie, how you doing? Howie, I want you to say hello to Marty Glickman. And I didn't even see Marty at first. I was just so happy to see Ernie Grunfeld, my old buddy from childhood. So I got the thrill of a lifetime by meeting and shaking hands with Marty Glickman. And I was an adult then. I wasn't a kid anymore. Yeah. And it was still very exciting. So
I cannot imagine, and I envy you guys all. I can't imagine what it's like growing up, living in New York, having all of that. Just right there in real life. That's one of the things Les talks about in the book. This how thrilled he was just to see how accessible everybody was, especially in that era. The players didn't have drivers. They didn't have bodyguards. They didn't have and even for himself when he first got to New York, and just like Les, I want you to be my friend, Babe Ruth. And it's like he was constantly flabbergasted at just how much real life interaction there was between players and teams. That's something that's probably changed a lot in the game.
Well, when I was working in New York, I'd always see celebrities. Everybody saw celebrities walking around, whether they were Broadway stars or athletes. everybody was always very friendly to me whenever I went up to say hello. Yul Brynner, gave me a little bit of a tough time until I told him I had just seen whatever the thing he was in on Broadway, The King and I.
King and
The
I.
only person who was ever nasty to me was Johnny Bench. He told me to go F myself, and I was wearing a business suit. I wasn't a kid. I wasn't asking for his autograph. I saw him walking down 6th Avenue, and I said, Johnny Bench, how are you? Nice to see you. And he said, go F yourself. I'll never forget that. I was like 35 years
An
old.
idiot.
I think he was retired by then. And, he's the only celebrity I can think of who was really nasty to me when I walk in the streets of Manhattan. But maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe he had a fight with his wife. Who cares?
It's always been, I mean, it's been one of the nice things about Hawaii is that I think in that sense is that this is a place that when celebrities come here, especially players, guys come out, we've had the Pro Bowl here and all that. And it's true of actors and all that. In Hawaii, people let their guards down. You can run into people on the street or in restaurants. They don't, it's different than LA where everything is behind walls and other people. So I can only imagine a taste of that.
Thank you, Dennis.
Bill, go
Johnny
ahead.
should
Bill.
have been benched.
Bill, go ahead.
Yes, Dennis, thank you for sharing your story with us. I just wanted to say that I had an uncle that lived in Philadelphia in the 60s, and he used to tell me that the basketball fans there couldn't wait to hear Les Keiter do the college basketball games from the Palestra.
Big Five.
Right, the Big Five. That he did a lot of that, and he had his, like he would call it, Panicsville, something like that,
Yeah,
And the
welcome to
fans-
Panicsville, USA. That's how we would start the broadcast.
Exactly. And I also remember he did the George Foreman gold medal fight for the heavyweight title in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City.
Yep. Wow. I think he mentioned, he has in that chapter, he just goes through a bunch of things of just called out highlights from the Olympics. And that was the only Olympics he ever covered, but it was amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks. Anybody else with a question who hasn't asked one?
Oh,
All right. I want to do one thing first before I call on Steve. Steve was talking before about, or Mars was talking about yogiisms. Now, these aren't yogiisms, but all through these years we've been talking about Les Keiter. Each one of you have told me one of his sayings. So I want you to direct your saying to Dennis. Steve, give me your best Keiter.
oh, he said them all. You should see him run. He beat the ball. He beat the ball. He beat the ball.
And he struck him out.
Oh yeah, and that's right. I forgot that's another one. Right, struck him out.
Harvey, did you have one?
Well, you should see him run, but Steve reminded me, what's the one you just said, Steve?
He beat the ball.
He beat the ball. He beat the ball. Yeah. It was, I remember one night, and it was at night. It was like a 13-minute at bat because I'm sure the ticket tape went down. And it was, I looked it up. It was a record number of foul balls. But my favorite was, you should see him run, and I would clap and I would see him run.
Steve, what was your question?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to point something out about Glickman. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm not sure. He didn't run in the Olympics. He wasn't allowed to run.
Right.
There's a whole story behind that. It's not just the Nazis. It was the Americans as well, which is one of the reasons why 50 years later, he went back to Germany, went back to the stadium that he was not allowed to run in, just to go back. I think I mentioned this before. His daughter, Esther, when I had my day camp in Rockland, she was a counselor for us for 1 year. She's one of the narrators of that Marty Glickman documentary. He was quite a guy, but this Les Keiter thing, boy, talk about, I said before, 65 years, talk about memories. You can hear it now with the transistor radio. And I still remember when the Giants lost that game, 11-10, my mother was ironing. I kicked over the ironing board.
Oh yeah. And I think I shut my father came in because that game ended and Les was still on the radio. And I told him, you know, Dad, shut up. Don't say anything.
Don
I mean,
Tarzik.
I could tell the Giants had lost, but I didn't believe they lost until Les Keiter told me they lost.
Well, Stephen Harvey, here's a good memory. The difference between an extra base hit that hit the fence and a home run was so dramatically different by Keiter. When a ball was hit over the fence, there's a high towering drive going away back, and then he had the sound effects, and he would go
Oh, yeah.
boom up against the fence.
Well, the phrase he would use, and I remember hearing this the first time, it would be back, boom, off the wall.
Yes, back. Off the
And
wall.
Yeah.
somewhere I remember that he had a drumstick, which
Yes.
he
And a wood block.
recreated the sound of a ball off a bat by hitting it on the block of a drummer's block.
Yeah.
And how
Yeah.
Oh, he
am I right?
just did.
And then he used a leather chair to recreate the ball hitting the catcher's mitt.
He was great.
No,
He was
I-
absolutely fantastic.
You
But
know what?
he had
It's
He had that wood block.
That's
He had that wood
Giant
block in
fan.
his office.
Did he really?
He had it in his office, and it looked like it looked like one of Bruce Springsteen's old guitars. It was
It
just
should be. It should be.
it was all banged up. It should be in Cooperstown.
You're right, because it's got more hits than Ty Cobb.
You know, back in the
Dennis,
day, you
Dennis,
listened to a night game, and you had the wire in your ear from the transistor radio.
Yeah.
And the games come on 11:15 at night, and then it doesn't end till about 2 a.m. Many times I'd fall asleep listening to the game, but then when my mother would wake me up to go to school, I would tell her I wasn't feeling well. She says, "I know what you've been doing all night long. You're going to school."
Dennis,
By the
you
way, the
mentioned-
Mets lost the
mentioned-
game 11-10 this week. Just thought I would
Dennis,
throw that in there.
you mentioned
11-10, right?
You mentioned that he was thinking that when he was offered the job, it would ruin his career. What did he say after this?
Oh, in the end, he simply admitted he was wrong. I don't know if it made his career, but well, I'll put it this way: there's no other organization that's ever called me up to ask him about his book. So it must have been one of the things that outlived that. Yeah, and his career, the biggest disappointment of his career was that he never got to be the play-by-play of a Major League Baseball team. That was it. That he was very outright that, and of course he was the story goes, and I've read it in other places too. He was set to be the voice of the Mets. He was teed up for that, and there was a brouhaha that happened with the sponsors. Everybody expected him to get that, and it wound up going to Lindsay in the end, who called him up and said, "Les, I'm sorry, I had no idea that this was even in there." But it was that was like the one thing he wasn't able to do, and one of his proudest moments was because he told people when he was a kid. There's stories of when he's a kid. He said one day he's going to be broadcasting sports live from Yankee Stadium. And he eventually did, and it was the Johansson
Lloyd Patterson.
Lloyd
Patterson flight. Yeah,
I went to that fight in the Polo Grounds with my pop.
So Dennis, here's the book again. It's 32 years old. Is there any way to get it other than eBay or something?
Yeah, well, that's right now. No, I've got an extra copy, and I'm going to send it off. I'll send it off to you, and if you guys want to shuttle it around, I did put the chapter in the chat here, so make sure you get that before you close things up. I'm calling up the guys at UH Press. This kind of inspired me to go back. Every once in a while, someone will call me up. What you said, you're somebody I know who I imagine must be digging up for some dirt on me on the internet or something, and they see, are you the same Dennis Christianson? Because it was on Amazon and so on. And I'm going to see if they'll, if at this stage they'll release it so that we can put it on like Amazon as an ebook, for a free download. The book's out of print. It's been 30 years since it was published. It's just a great story to share. But if you do come across a real book, one of the great things in it is I like books. They're real life things. You touch them, you hold them. But it is just loaded with photographs, not just all that actually have him in it. So there you have Patterson and Johansson, and there's Les, right there at that shoulder up there, at the microphone there. And down here is John Wayne, who is sitting two seats away from watching it ringside. I mean, so there are great books and great photos in it. Shots of his kid, when he was doing the Yankees pregame show, and of his oldest boy Ricky, who I've met many times, with Yogi Berra, with Mickey Mantle and so on, and shots of him interviewing Casey Stengel. The first time he was introduced to Casey Stengel, some brought him up, said, "Hey, Casey, I want you to meet our new broadcaster." And Stengel looked him up and down and said, "I don't need a goddamn broadcaster. I need a pitcher." And went back, turned around back to the batting cage.
Dennis, I think you can gather by the crowd tonight. He just the memories that you brought back to these guys and gals, Indy, of course. You made their night. I'm so grateful that I was able, patting myself on the back to track you down. I know when I first spoke to you, you were like, "What the hell does this guy want?" But
I figured it was either a salesman or a collector, and then when I saw the name Marty Glick, I went, "Oh yeah, definitely a salesman." I'm sorry, Gary Mintz. Anyway, thank you. It was a delight when you called, and I'm really stoked to.
Let's all give it up for Dennis. And Dennis, if you send that book out, please sign it, and I will pass it along to everybody. So give it up for Dennis Christianson. Dennis, don't be a stranger.
Thank you, guys.
Dennis, I got a question.
Sure. Go ahead, Renee.
Could you elaborate a little more about him losing the job for the Mets? I mean, what happened?
I'm gonna turn the book. It was set up. One of the things, especially, I didn't even notice it that much when I was writing it. Part of it is because I now run an advertising marketing firm here. I have now for 30 some years. After I moved out of television into some things here, so I learned a lot more about the business. So now the questions I would ask him, now the observations I would make if I was doing it today would be really different. One of the things I noticed in that was, was really surprising to me is just how entrepreneurial broadcasting was. These guys would independent guys would own station. I mean, it was not a Rupert Murdoch world. The individual personalities would buy and sell these stations and work on them, and he would and the advertisers, the guys who would come in, talk about doing White Owl cigars, and if the guys from White Owl Cigars came in and said, "Yeah, and we want to make sure we're keeping Keiter on here," or things like that, that was how it was as entrepreneurial as sports ownership was and everything at that time. So as he describes it, it had to do that it was set up that they wanted somebody who they wanted to have Mets wanted to put that, make sure they had really strong New York roots down, which is why they brought in Stengel to coach. They wanted to bring in a broadcaster that New York knew. It was backed by their advertising agency, BBD&O, Les's old friend Tom Vellante, and when everything happened, they're waiting for the call, and then it came in as a complete surprise. He found out that like the advertising agency had been fired. I think it was a whole changeover with the sponsorship of the Mets and the people coming in and all of that. So it wasn't so much that Les was out, but that a whole squad of people was out. And
That's a shame.
and that Lindsey Nelson, got the nod, and who was an old friend of Les's. They've been friends for a long time.
He was a football announcer. Lindsey Nelson did football, college football, Cotton Bowl.
College.
Yep.
Thank you.
They wanted a baseball broadcaster. They brought in Bob Murphy, who was doing the Orioles, and they wanted the next player, so they brought in Keiter, and that's how the three of them started.
Well, thank you,
Dennis, I have a question.
Thanks a lot.
Dennis, you have time for one more.
I have a question for Dennis.
Mars, Dennis, you have
Yeah,
time
Dennis.
for one more?
I'm good.
Mars, Mars, stop.
What?
Dennis, do you have time for one more question?
Oh, of course I do. Absolutely.
Andy McHugh, go ahead.
Thank you, Gary. I just wanted to say there is a website called addall.com, ADDALL.com, and it currently has 23 copies of the book on sale for anybody who's truly interested in it. So I'll just leave it at that, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Mars, go ahead.
Yeah, Dennis, I have a question.
Yeah.
I think the Johansson Patterson fight was 1960. I know it was in the Polo Grounds. My pop took me to that fight. But in championship fights in those days, did Keiter do that on radio and Don Dunphy? If it was televised, did it on television?
I think that was all on radio at that time for him. I know that's where I heard it. But I don't know specifically. There was. I'm looking at there's the shot of him and Cosell. Make sure where's my camera here? Here we go. Him and Cosell ringside at that fight. Les looks younger. Howard looks exactly the same as he always did. Because there were 3 Patterson Johansson fights,
Right?
and I know the one that left, made such a mark in him was doing the one he did from Yankee Stadium. So, but I don't know, all the details on that.
There was one in the Polo Grounds.
Yeah.
Thank you,
That's
Mars.
the one I went to.
All right, we'll go to Bill, Dan, and then we're going to wrap it up. Bill, go ahead
Okay.
again.
Yeah, Gary. Thank you, Gary. I just want to say to Steve that he mentioned about Marty Glickman not being allowed to run in the 36 Olympics. Also, Sam Stoller was not allowed, the 2 Jewish runners on that team.
Right.
Wow.
Those were 2 of them.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Dan, go ahead. Finish us up.
Dennis, just to kind of bring it full circle, what ultimately brought Les to Hawaii? And I'm not asking about an airplane or a boat. And did he do anything else other than the Islanders over there? I mean, other than his anchoring, did he do UH football or basketball or any other sports on the islands?
He did do stuff. He did some. I was actually in the station director's chair for some fights that he did here locally. He got called out to do a few gigs away from that. He never did. He didn't do any other play-by-play here, I think, besides the Islanders of any duration. He dropped in and did, he would drop in and do, guest stints now and again with different things. And as I said, he would still get called away as he was for the, for the Duran fight. So it, and what was amazing is that, like, again, most people in Hawaii, they just knew him as our guy that had been to him. People just had no idea. And he had to pry this stuff out of him. He wouldn't name drop. I mean, every once in a while we'd finish a sportscast and go to break or something. And if they had been interviewing somebody, or sometimes it was an obit or something, and he dropped something just to us, the studio crew there, saying something like, I met him once. He'd tell some little story, but that would be it. He would be the last person. He could have been such a bore, and he just never was. And what brought him over here, it was this same kind of thing, is that some of these station owners, as they would have different things, and that's what brought him here, and it is part of what brought him back here. But when he actually came back here, his main thing was he was going to mainly retire from sports. And like a lot of sports guys, then he started an ad agency. There's a lot of ad agencies in that 60s era, 70s era, that because they were good at talking, and they would know car guys, and they would do things. So he actually came back here and started an ad agency, and then got pulled back into broadcasting a little bit to his chagrin, and but of course that's what he wanted to do. It's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be a sportscaster since he was a kid. When he was playing little league games, he would sit there at shortstop or right field, and he would announce the games out loud while the game was going on. So it's the kind of kid that he was.
Great, thanks.
Dennis, thanks so much for spending this hour with us. Guys,
Yeah, thanks, Dennis.
It was great fun. It's made me more nervous than anything I've done at work in months.
Well,
So,
I gotta tell you something. After I'm done here, I'm gonna call you to make you more nervous about something else. So expect a phone call, and it'll be a good phone call. Good thing to talk to you about. But give it
Hopefully
up,
you won't
Dennis.
get muted.
Okay, all.
Have a great
take
night,
care.
everybody. I will hang out
Okay.
in the room and close it down. Good night,
Okay.
everybody.